This is the Greek world, and this is the Greek world on colonisation. In the 7th century BCE, the ancient Greeks had a problem born of prosperity. Life had been getting fairly good for them lately, and the many small independent states of what is today Greece had increased in size and in wealth. But the land hadn't gotten more fertile, and the livestock hadn't gotten fatter. Traditionally, when a Greek person died, they would divide up their land equally amongst their heirs. So say you have Grandad Greek, who has this huge great estate, and it's lovely, but then he has 4 living children, and he divides this great estate into 4 much smaller farms, which they can still live off. But then each of them, say, has 4 children that live, and then each of them has 4 children, and before you know it, they're all granted plots of land so small, there's not even enough space to dig a shallow grave to bury their malnourished corpses in. Luckily, there is a simple and elegant solution to this. Take all of the excess people that you don't have space for, and just move them somewhere else. And so begins the golden age of Greek colonization. A fair number of the Greek cities, mostly coastal ones, started packing large amounts of their population onto ships, and just sending them off to fuck knows where in the hope that they can start living better lives for themselves out there. And you know, a lot of them did. From the south of France, to Sicily, to even like the Russian rivers up in the north of the Black Sea. Eventually the Greeks were spread out around the Mediterranean like frogs around the edge of a pond. And luckily for us, we actually have a fairly detailed story of how one of these colonies was founded. Meet Herodotus. He's called the father of history, sometimes called the father of lies. But he's the first guy we know of who tried to find the truth in the past and not just a good story. And he wasn't always very good at it, but in his defense, revolutionary and unique works of literature are very rarely refined ones. And, you know, it's long and deviating, but once you've read the whole thing, it does all actually fit together quite nicely. And a lot of it, especially the first 5 books, often read quite a bit more like a travel journal than a history book. And there's good reason for this, because one of the things that Herodotus absolutely loved was a bit of tourism. By the standards of an ancient Greek, he was a fairly well-travelled bloke. He'd seen Anatolia and Syria, he'd cruised down the Euphrates into Mesopotamia, he'd spent a fair bit of time in Egypt, and he even managed to sneak across to Libya for a little while to see what that was like. And it's while he's in Libya that he has one of these moments that you sometimes have when you're on holiday, when you meet a fellow countryman out there. Other Greeks, all the way down in Africa. But they weren't all tourists like he was. A lot of them were colonists, some of whose families had been there for generations. And they were all too keen to tell Herodotus the story of how they got there. So it all started in the mid-7th century BCE when some delegates from the island of Thera, modern Santorini, went to go and visit the oracle at Delphi. The oracle of Apollo had told them that they were destined to found a city in Libya. But none of the Therans had a fucking clue what a Libya was, so they did what they thought was the sensible thing, and they ignored Apollo and just went about their business. But this turned out to be a mistake. The island of Thera saw no rainfall for 7 years, and they all started to suffer from the horrific drought. The population of the island was already too large for it to maintain, so it wasn't long before starvation kicked in. So they do what all Greeks do when they're presented with a problem, and they go back to the oracle at Delphi. And they're like, Apollo, what is this whole drought business about? And the oracle responds by being like, look, I've already told you what to do. You have to colonize Libya. What more do you want from me? Okay, thought the Therans, we have to find out where Libya is, and then we need to colonize it. And when it comes to mysterious foreign lands, no one's better to ask than the seafaring people of Crete. So off to Crete they go to gather some intel, and whilst they're there they come across a dye merchant called Corobius. Corobius tells a tale that one day he was sailing to the Levant to get some of that sweet purple dye from the Phoenicians so he could sell it back in Greece, when a southerly wind blew him off course, and he had to take shelter in an island just off the coast of Libya. If the Therans were willing to pay him some money, he would happily take them there. So they do pay him, and he does take them. So the ships get to the island, and they thank Corobius for his help by leaving him there. Yeah, they leave him there, but they give him some supplies, and as they leave, they shout something to the effect of, "We'll be back soon." But they were not back soon, and Corobius would have starved on the island if it weren't for a ship from Samos being blown off course just as he had been and having to take shelter in the island. he joins their crew, and together they have a completely separate adventure, which we sadly don't have time for today. Back on the island of Thera, the people are debating how to best go about this whole colony thing. And they decide the best thing to do is to take one in every 2 siblings from every household across the island, put them on a boat and send them off. And they choose for the leader of the expedition a man named Battus. Battus wasn't his real name, by the way. His real name was probably Aristotle or something like that. Battus is actually the Greek word for stammerer, and a lot of Greeks thought he got this name later in life because of a speech impediment that he had. But Herodotus, the well-travelled and cultured Greek that he is, has a different theory. He's been to Libya and he knows that the Libyan word for king is Battus. And so he thinks that when they arrived in Libya, the leader of the expedition named himself king to really emphasise who was in charge here. So anyways, Battus and his companions board 2 pentaconters, which are these Greek ships, and they set sail. And pentaconters, they're not large ships, which suggests that, honestly, if there were more than 200 colonists, that's a lot. So this isn't a particularly large expedition right here. But regardless, Battus and his crew go boldly where no Greek has gone before. And in a stunning display of honest leadership, Battus turns around and admits that he hasn't got a fucking clue what he's doing. And so with a resigned sigh of, well, we tried, the Greeks turn straight back around and head back to Thera. But they never make it ashore. As soon as they get to the harbour of Thera and as soon as they're in arrow range, the people who had been their friends and family mere days before open fire on them, which I think is a bit of a testament to the seriousness of this situation. In fact, some hints as to how seriously this mission was taken can be found on an archaeological find which is a stroke of extraordinary luck. The oath that the colonists swore when they arrived at Libya was carved into marble and is preserved for us today, so we can see what these people were all about. Helpfully, the oath confirms a few of the elements of Herodotus' story, that one person was taken from every household in Thera, and that the leader of the expedition was called Battus. But it also mentions one extra detail as to how they went about this. That anyone who would refuse to sail when the city wants to send him would be liable to death penalty, and his belongings should be confiscated. That anyone who would shelter or conceal him, be it a father for his son or a brother for his brother, should be liable to the same penalty as the rebel. Well, doesn't that just sound lovely? So yeah, turning back was not an option. So back to Libya they went. Or at least back to this little island just off the coast of Libya. It was on this island that the Greeks docked their ships, set up a settlement, started to get comfy, and promptly began to suffer. Okay, so here's the island that we're talking about on Google Maps. Notice how no one's fucking living here. And that's because no one in their right mind would ever want to live here. So Battus and his gang of starving settlers do the only thing they know how to do in a time of crisis. They send delegates to the oracle at Delphi. And they aren't happy. They storm in like, Apollo, you dick. You told us that if we went to Libya, everything would be fine. Well, we've been to Libya. It's hot, it's dry, nothing fucking grows there. Now I'm miserable and malnourished. So what is all this about? Apollo, the cheeky bugger, responds snarkily by being like, oh, you must be a very clever man if you know more than me about sheep breeding Libya, given that I've been there and you fucking haven't. And you see, it's this kind of pedantic bullshit that I reckon was the downfall of the Greco-Roman pantheon. Apollo refused to fulfill his promise because the Greek colonists hadn't actually been to Libya, they'd only been to an island only just off the coast of Libya, which is... So they go back to the island and they tell everyone that they're gonna up and leave and go to shore. Which they do, and wouldn't you know, Apollo is actually useful for a change, and things are fairly good for 6 years. But although things seem to have been fairly friendly with the natives, eventually the local Libyans, for some reason or another, get sick of the Greeks living there, and they decide to trick them into going somewhere else. They say, look, there's this much, much better place to live, a few days travel west of here, and we'll even guide you, if you like. And Battus and his friends are like, oh yeah, okay, that sounds great. And so the Libyans do take them there, but they're careful to travel at night through certain places on account of the fact that there was all this fantastic farmland and all these great things that the Greeks would obviously want to colonize, but the Libyans wanted to, keep away from them because it belonged to them. So they take them through these places at night so that the Greeks can't see any of it, and they reach somewhere called Apollo's Spring. And it is here that the colonists found the city of Cyrene. And everything works out great. The locals leave the Greeks there to just plod along for a little while. Battus reigns for 40 years as king and then hands over to his son, who rules for another 16 years. In this time, the colony didn't really grow that much, but they seem to be doing fairly well for themselves. But it's in the reign of the third king, Battus the Prosperous, clues in the name, that Cyrene starts to really, well, you know, prosper. One of the reasons for this is that one of the plants that grows in Cyrene is silphium, which was an ancient herb that was used for seasoning. It was used a lot in medicine, and it was conveniently both an aphrodisiac and a contraceptive, which is a helpful pairing if ever I heard of one. And with this new resource at his disposal, King Battus sends out a kind of PSA to the Greek world saying, look, Cyrene is doing really well and we will welcome more settlers if only you're willing to come. And loads of them did. In fact, so many did that the natives, the people who had showed them Cyrene in the hopes that they'd just stay there and mind their own business, started to get pushed off their land and abused by the new arriving hordes of Greek colonists. And eventually the Libyan tribes have had enough and they appeal to the traditional power in the region, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he sends an Egyptian army to sort out these Greek settlers. But according to Herodotus, he seems to have underestimated the Greeks a fair bit. He was not prepared to meet an actual, large Greek army. And his invasion force is absolutely thrashed. It's thrashed so badly, the pharaoh is overthrown, and the dynasty is destabilized so much that it won't be long before the Persians can come in and just kick them all out. Which is a hell of an achievement for a city that is only 3 generations old. I mean, Egypt was a very large and powerful kingdom. So, good on them, I guess. The rest of Cyrenaican history plays out along similar themes to the rest of Greek history generally. There's political disputes, there's internal squabbling, there's wars, etc., etc. The dynasty of Battus lasts for about 200 years before it's overthrown by a democratic revolution, which doesn't bother me too much because I have no time for dynasties that can't come up with more than 2 names for their monarchs. Or even worse, only 1 name, like Ptolemaic Egypt. Was an absolute nightmare. And yeah, eventually the Romans conquer it, but that's fine. Cyrene continues to be a very, very prosperous city, even under Roman domination. The story of Cyrene is undoubtedly a successful one, in my opinion at least. We have to remember that when Battus, the original Battus, set sail from Thera, if Herodotus is to be believed, he only had maybe 200 colonists on those ships. But within 4 generations, the Cyrenaicans are fielding armies of thousands of hoplites, and that is a fast-growing colony if ever I saw one. And thinking about Cyrene got me thinking about colonists throughout all of history. From the original English settlers that had to cannibalize each other when they first reached the Americas, to the many Polynesians who set sail to voyage across the world's largest ocean, hoping to set up homes on the many, many tiny islands that exist thousands of miles apart on it, to even the Old Norse who tried very, very hard to live in Greenland, something that sounds hellish to me. I mean, winter is hard enough here in the UK when it doesn't get light until like 8 in the morning. I can't imagine what it's like to live in the fucking Arctic Circle. Being a colonist was really, really hard. The story of the founding of Cyrene is a turbulent one, but through what seems to be very competent leadership, perseverance, and a lot of luck, the Therans managed to actually make a home in Libya. But even then, there are a lot of close calls, which I think in many ways must speak to the desperation of some of these people. How much food shortage was probably having a really, really hard impact on the Greek mainland. I mean, that Theran drought already got them in a position that people were willing to fire arrows at their own friends and family, simply because they knew there wasn't enough for them on their home island. The decision to head out to sea, not knowing what lies waiting on the other side of it, but hoping that you can live there, isn't a decision that human beings take lightly. The Cyrenaican settlers could have been wiped out in those first few decades through starvation or conflict with the locals, but by some miracle they survived and made a prosperous trading city there. And in the end, it wouldn't be any of the perils of colonization that would bring Cyrene down, it would just be the economy. The Roman Empire was going through a very, very hard time in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, and there simply wasn't enough money to keep Cyrene going. It is, after all, a city in the middle of the desert. On top of that, the silphium, the herb that made the city so wealthy, made it so worth settling, was harvested to extinction. It doesn't exist anymore. Historians don't even know for sure what plant group it belonged to, but there's no more of it. Meaning that by the time the 5th century CE rolls around, Cyrene was well into transitioning from a city into a ruin. And a ruin it remains today. But the story of its founders, which was passed down probably through oral tradition from the people themselves to their great-great-grandchildren, and then across to Herodotus, some tourist who rocked up in their city at one point, who then, through the miracle of the written word, passes it down to us over 2.5 millennia later, that survives. And that, in itself, I think is enough to make it worth remembering. Thanks for watching.